In this video, we'll look at how to set up constraints and animate constraints. To set up a constraint, let's just take our groups here and we'll ungroup everything. So we'll take our cube out of the group and our sphere from underneath the cube. And I'm going to put the cube position back at 0, and we'll put the position of the sphere at 0. So the difference between setting up a group and a constraint, again, is groups cannot be animated on and off, but constraints can be. So in order to set up a constraint, you would be in animation mode, and you can see the constraint. So I'm going to pull that off here. And you can see the first one is a parent constraint. To set this up, it's in the reverse order of the child-parent grouping. So we know that child-parent grouping is first the child, then the parent, and you hit P. And now the cube is the parent. So for this, it's reverse order. So first you select the parent, the thing that is going to be the controller, and then the child, and you hit parent. What this does is it selects this sphere and automatically puts a connection on here. So now these cannot be animated. The cube, for instance, now is the controller. So wherever you move the cube, the sphere is going to move and rotate and scale with it from that particular point. And you can see in the hypergraph that there is no child-parent connection here. So what you can do, once again, is you can select the sphere, and now you will see that in the inputs here under the shape, you have a p-cube connection. So this p-cube connection can be turned on and off. So 0 is off, 1 is on. So right now that it is set to 1, again, when I move or rotate or do anything to this cube, this sphere follows. If this is set to 0, and I go ahead and move or rotate the cube, you'll notice that the sphere is not following along. So in terms of animation, we can set it up so that this starts out at 1 for the parent, and we can say, okay, it's going to be keyed at 1, so we could just right click and say key. You can select your cube, move it around wherever you want, rotate it, and hit S so that you can key that where you want, then maybe go to another frame, position it, rotate it, scale it, and hit S to key that. So now you have this kind of thing happening here. And then maybe on frame 180, we would say, okay, let's make sure we take this parent, right? We already know that we've keyed it to frame, we've keyed the cube to frame 100, so we would have to say at frame 100, this parent is still going to be keyframed, so we would right click, key it, so that way we would have a hold here, and then we would go to frame 180 or whatever frame we would want to go to, select the sphere and put it at 0 and hit key selected. So now if we were to move this cube once again at frame 180 to somewhere else and scale it down and hit S, we would see at a certain point the sphere would no longer be connected to that cube. Okay, so that is setting up a simple parent constraint. Now let's look at some other types of constraints. So I'm going to create a polycube again, and I'm just going to duplicate it and move it over. So you also have point constraints, orient constraints. So point constraints will set it to a position. Orient constraint is a rotation. Scale constraint is for scale. So you have position, rotate, scale, and then an aim constraint will make the object follow or look at the other object. So again, parent, child, and you can hit aim. So anywhere that this gets positioned, this will look at it or follow it. So you can see here in this aim constraint how that is pulling or moving along. So that can be animated. And you can again turn that on and off by selecting this cube and clicking 0 to have it no longer follow, or 1 to have it follow. And then you would right click, set that keyframe in order to set that keyframe. And remember that to view the keys that are on objects, you need to select the actual object. And since this constraint is not being selected, you're actually selecting the cube, you would have to select the constraint through the hypergraph. So remember, window, hypergraph hierarchy, and then select the constraint to actually see. If you set your keyframe here, you would see its keyframe in the timeline. So if you select your cube, you're not seeing the constraint keyframe because that keyframe is being held on the constraint node. It's good practice to create a group along with a constraint. The reason is because when you create a constraint, it automatically connects the attributes that you're constraining so that you cannot set keyframes on those attributes. So for instance, once again, if I take this cube and then I shift select this cube and I do a constrain, aim constraint, we know that this cube now controls the rotation of this cube. And we can see that by selecting it and seeing that we have these blue colors on rotate, meaning that these rotates are now controlled by this cube. So setting keyframes on this by selecting the cube and rotating it would really kind of mess up the connections that are happening. We would have overlapping or conflicting connections because this cube is the thing that controls those rotations. So in order to have something that we can control the rotations of, but at the same time still be able to animate, we could use a grouping system for this. So let me do Control Z to undo to get back just to the two cubes. Okay, and what we will do is we'll select our cube 2 that we're going to be controlling, and with it selected we'll do Control G on our keyboard. Control G will create a group. Okay. Now the important thing here is that we need to make sure that the group, which is currently located way over here, say if we select that group, it's located at 0, 0, we need to make sure the group is where we want the rotation to occur from, which in this case would be the center of this cube. So we just go to Modify, Center Pivot, and that centers the group to the cube. So they both have the same position or the same center point. Now what we can do is we can select our controlling cube, then we select the group. So not the cube, but we select the group for the second cube. So you have to be in the hierarchy or the outliner. And then you go to Constrain and Aim. When you do this, the aim constraint gets put onto the group. So you can see here we have an aim constraint node on the group, and that's where the connection is, and that's where you can animate that connection on and off by doing 0 or 1. So if we move this cube, it will move this cube because cube 2 is a child of the group. So that's how it's controlling it. But the good thing again about this kind of a connection is that we can still grab cube 2 and there are no connections coming in because all the connections are being made to the group. So that allows us to select group 2 and animate and change its rotations without affecting the connections coming in. So that way now we can animate the rotates independently or the cube independently and not have to worry about double connections or conflict connections coming in on the aim constraint. That is a basic overview of constraints. Thank you for watching.